The chandeliers glowed above the vast concert hall, their golden light spilling across polished floors that reflected everything like a mirror. Every seat was covered in plush red velvet, waiting for the audience that would arrive that evening. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh wax, the kind that clung to wooden armrests and glossy instruments. At the center of the stage stood the grand piano, shining like an untouchable jewel, its black surface reflecting the emptiness of the room. It was the kind of piano that looked too sacred to touch, the kind that cost more than most people's homes, and tonight it would be the heart of the performance everyone in the city was talking about. Marcus Duval walked across the stage like it already belonged to him. He was dressed casually, but even in rehearsal his presence demanded attention. He carried himself with the assurance of a man who had been told since boyhood that he was extraordinary, the kind of prodigy the world should be grateful for. His fingers danced effortlessly across the keys as he played fragments of a piece, not the full composition, just enough to feel the instrument respond beneath his hands. Each note rang sharp, proud, perfect. Marcus wasn't playing for practice. He was playing for himself, enjoying the way the sound filled the empty room. From the back corner, a mop swished quietly against the floor. A woman moved slowly between the aisles, pushing a bucket with one hand, the mop in the other. She worked with the kind of tired precision that came from years of repetition, each stroke steady, careful not to leave streaks. Her navy uniform hung a little loose on her frame, her hair pulled back tight, her eyes focused on the floor as if the shine she left behind mattered more than anyone realized. She didn't know that her presence had already caught Marcus's attention. He paused mid-scale, resting his elbows lightly on the keys, letting a discordant sound echo like an unfinished thought. He tilted his head toward her. "You there?" he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the hall like a command. The mop stopped. She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, she didn't speak, as if unsure if she'd misheard. "Yes, you," Marcus said, gesturing lazily with one hand as though pointing out a misplaced object. "Do you like music?" The woman nodded politely, her voice quiet but clear. "I do, sir." A smile crept across Marcus's face, but it wasn't kind. It was the sharp, knowing smile of someone about to make a joke at another's expense. "Well, that's convenient," he said, standing and stepping back from the piano. He gestured to the shining instrument like a showman introducing a stage prop. "Why don't you give us a performance, then? One note, too, see if you've got any talent hidden away." The stagehands nearby chuckled under their breath, exchanging glances as if they had been invited into a private jest. Marcus leaned against the edge of the piano, clearly enjoying himself. The woman froze in place, her hands still gripping the mop handle. Her expression was unreadable, caught between confusion and discomfort. "I'm here to clean," she said finally, her words careful, almost apologetic. "Exactly," Marcus replied with mock sweetness. "But tonight perhaps you can entertain us. Surely you've dreamt of touching something like this piano, haven't you? Don't be shy. One little note won't hurt." The stagehand snickered again, and the sound hit her like a reminder that this was supposed to be funny, to them, not to her. She glanced at the mop bucket, at the reflection of the golden chandeliers on the still water. Something hardened in her chest. She had been invisible in this place for years, her work unnoticed except when it wasn't perfect. Now, for the first time, every eye was on her, but not in admiration. In mockery. Marcus arched an eyebrow, the smirk never leaving his face. "Unless," he said, tilting his head with deliberate cruelty, "you're afraid." Her jaw tightened. Slowly, she leaned the mop against a nearby seat and wiped her hands on her uniform. She didn't say a word as she began walking toward the stage. Her shoes squeaked faintly against the floor, each step echoing in the vast, empty room. The laughter died down. The stagehand stopped smirking, suddenly curious. Marcus straightened, his smirk flickering as he realized she had actually accepted. The woman climbed the steps with steady composure, though her heart thudded in her chest. The piano loomed in front of her, magnificent and intimidating, its surface so polished she could see herself reflected in it. She paused, letting her fingers hover above the keys without pressing them, as if asking silent permission. Marcus leaned back on the bench, folding his arms. "Go on, dear," he said smoothly, though his tone was dripping with condescension. "Show us what you've got." Her fingertips grazed the ivory keys. The feel of them was electric, sending a shiver up her arm. It had been so long, too long, since she had touched a piano. Memories she had buried deep stirred inside her, the sound of old church hymns, the lessons she had once scraped pennies to take, the evenings she spent practicing until her fingers ached. Music had once been her dream, but life had demanded she choose work over wonder. Still, the knowledge hadn't left her hands. She pressed a single note, soft and clear. It hung in the air longer than expected, the resonance filling the silence. Then she added another, and another, the beginnings of something fragile but deliberate. Marcus chuckled. "Careful, now. Don't break it." But the chuckle died quickly, because the fragile thread of sound suddenly blossomed into something more. Her hands began to move with certainty, a rhythm emerging from the keys, one that wasn't hesitant at all. It was gentle, flowing, like a stream winding its way through rocks. Each note carried something he hadn't expected: emotion, depth, truth. The stagehands, who had been waiting for her to embarrass herself, fell still. Their eyes widened as the music began to take shape, as though the air itself had shifted. Marcus's smirk faltered, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. Her shoulders relaxed as she let herself sink into the music. She wasn't showing off, she was remembering who she had once been. Every key she pressed unlocked another piece of herself, and though the song wasn't yet complete, even the unfinished beginning carried weight, carried soul. The hall, which only moments ago echoed with mocking laughter, now seemed to listen. And Marcus Duval, for the first time in a long time, felt small. The woman's fingers lingered on the last note of her short, improvised melody. The sound faded into silence, leaving a tension so thick it was almost unbearable. She sat back slightly, her face calm but her eyes alive in a way no one had ever seen before in this hall. The stagehands exchanged looks. None of them laughed now. Marcus cleared his throat, forcing a laugh that came out brittle. "Well," he said quickly, as if trying to regain control of the moment. "That was unexpected." But his voice wavered, and everyone noticed. The woman stood slowly, wiping her palms again on her uniform. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She had already said everything with her hands. And in that silence, in that heavy pause before the world moved again, every single person in the room knew one thing: whatever came next, nothing would be the same. The silence after the last note still hung heavy in the air, as though the piano itself refused to let go of what had just been born from its keys. Lila stepped back, her chest rising and falling slowly, her hands returning to her sides like nothing had happened, as though she had not just changed the atmosphere of the entire hall. She glanced once at Marcus, saw his fixed smile and the faint twitch of his jaw, and then turned as though ready to walk back to her mop and bucket. But the sound of quiet murmurs stopped her, stagehands whispering, a few clapping softly as if they didn't know if it was appropriate, but unable to contain the instinct. It wasn't a performance, not really, but something in what she had played had moved them beyond politeness. Marcus forced himself to clap once, slow and deliberate, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Bravo," he said, his words echoing too loudly. "A fine surprise. Truly. Who knew?" His smirk returned, though it felt brittle on his lips. He wasn't about to let a cleaning woman, of all people, steal his stage even for a moment. "Play another," one of the stagehands whispered, not to Marcus but to Lila. Another nodded quickly, their eyes fixed on her. Marcus's expression hardened, though he laughed in mock amusement. No, I think the lady has had her fun. We wouldn't want her to overstep, now would we?" He turned his gaze sharply toward her, the unspoken command clear: "Return to your bucket, stay in your place." But Lila didn't move. Something had shifted inside her, something she had spent years burying under long shifts and silent corridors. The weight of humiliation had transformed into quiet defiance. For once, she wasn't invisible, and the temptation to reclaim that part of herself, the part that had once believed music could be her life, was too strong. She let her fingers hover over the keys again, not pressing them, but daring. Marcus noticed and stepped closer, his tone lowering. "That's enough," he said, his smile gone now, replaced by irritation. "This instrument is reserved for those who understand it. You've had your laugh. Go on." The words cut through her, but not in the way he expected. They only reminded her of every door that had been slammed in her face before she had given up on her dreams. She had been told once that she was too poor to afford proper lessons, too busy to attend recitals, too ordinary to belong in concert halls. And now, years later, here was yet another man in fine clothing telling her she wasn't worthy. Her lips parted before she realized she was speaking. "Music doesn't belong to you," she said softly, her voice carrying in the quiet hall. "It belongs to anyone who feels it." The stagehands exchanged startled glances. Marcus froze, caught off guard by the quiet boldness of her words. His eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, the heavy side door creaked open, and the theater director stepped in. "Marcus!" the director called warmly, striding across the hall. "How are we this evening? Rehearsal going well?" His eyes landed briefly on Lila standing at the piano, and then shifted back to Marcus, not yet registering the tension in the room. "I hope everything is ready. Tonight's crowd is going to be massive. The mayor is in attendance, a few patrons from the cultural board. This has to be perfect." Marcus seized the opportunity, straightening quickly. "Of course," he said with a false laugh, moving away from Lila as though distancing himself from her presence. "Everything is fine. Just entertaining the staff." He shot her a glance sharp enough to pierce, his meaning clear: stay silent. But the director's attention lingered. "Did you play something?" he asked, turning back to Lila, curiosity in his eyes. "I thought I heard." "She?" Marcus interrupted, laughing again. No. Just fooling around. You know how it is. Best not to put ideas in anyone's head." The director gave a polite smile, but there was doubt in his eyes. Still, he turned away, too focused on the evening to probe further. "Well, Marcus, I'll leave you to it. Make sure you're rested. Tonight has to shine." He left as abruptly as he had arrived, the door closing behind him. The moment it shut, Marcus turned sharply toward Lila, his voice low but tense. "You made me look foolish," he hissed, his composure finally cracking. "Don't think for one second that anyone will remember your little stunt. I've trained for decades. You clean floors. Don't confuse one with the other." Lila met his gaze, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "I don't need anyone to remember," she said calmly. "I just needed you to hear it." The words struck deeper than he wanted to admit. Marcus spun back toward the piano, his fingers striking the keys harshly as though to drown out her voice. But the music he produced sounded hollow, forced, stripped of the effortless confidence he once carried. He slammed his hands down in frustration, the sound jarring in the empty space. The stagehands stood awkwardly to the side, no longer amused, no longer laughing at his jokes. They had seen something raw and real in Lila's brief playing, and it had unsettled them in ways they couldn't explain. They whispered quietly among themselves, the name, Marcus Duval, suddenly less untouchable. Lila stepped off the stage, her footsteps steady, her shoulders squared. She picked up her mop again, her hands steady now, not trembling. She returned to her work as though nothing had happened, but inside, her chest was light, alive. She hadn't expected to feel this way again. For years she had accepted her silence, but now, for the first time in decades, she had remembered the sound of her own soul. Marcus sat at the piano, staring down at the keys, but all he could hear was the echo of her melody, haunting him, mocking him, reminding him that brilliance wasn't his alone to own. And though the concert that night would carry his name in bold letters across the marquee, he already knew the truth. When the staff whispered in the wings, when the stagehands recalled this rehearsal years from now, it wouldn't be his performance they remembered. It would be hers. The thought made his chest tighten with something he had never felt before: fear. And the night had not even begun. The evening came swiftly, and with it the concert hall transformed from quiet rehearsal space into a cathedral of expectation. Outside, cars lined the street, their headlights flashing against the glass doors as finely dressed patrons arrived, their laughter and chatter filling the crisp night air. Inside, ushers guided them to their velvet seats, while chandeliers glowed brighter than before, casting a golden sheen over every corner. The grand piano sat at the center of the stage like a throne, its lid raised high, its polished surface flawless. Backstage, Marcus Duval paced in front of a mirror, adjusting his cufflinks, rehearsing the smile he would wear when the curtain rose. He could hear the muffled swell of voices in the audience, could feel the anticipation like heat pressing against the walls. Tonight, he told himself, would remind everyone why he was the master. Tonight they would forget the absurd little moment earlier, the woman, the whispers. He would bury it under brilliance. Yet when his fingers flexed, there was a faint tremor he couldn't disguise from himself. The echo of her melody haunted him, stubborn as a ghost. No matter how he tried to shake it away, the memory clung to him, the way she played without hesitation, as though the keys were hers by right. He cursed himself for even thinking of her now. In the wings, Lila continued her work, mop and bucket hidden away now so as not to offend the eyes of the elite. She had been told by the director earlier to stay invisible during the performance. That was her role tonight, silent, unseen, necessary but unacknowledged. But as she stood in the dim corridor, she couldn't stop the sound of that piano from pulling at her. It called to her, reminded her of what she had once loved, what she had once lost. She had promised herself she wouldn't dream again, but the feel of those keys beneath her fingers had cracked something open. She couldn't close it anymore. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the audience as the announcer's voice boomed with grandeur. "Ladies and gentlemen, the incomparable Marcus Duval." Applause thundered as Marcus strode onto the stage, bowing with polished grace, his practiced smile plastered firmly in place. He sat at the piano, adjusted his posture, and let his fingers hover dramatically above the keys. Silence deepened. He struck the first chord, and the sound filled the hall, bold and commanding. The audience leaned forward, captivated. To them, he was flawless. But inside, Marcus felt each note ring hollow, like reciting words he had said too many times before. His music, though technically perfect, lacked the fire he used to summon with ease. And then, as his fingers carried him deeper into the composition, his mind betrayed him. He heard her. He heard the echo of the cleaning woman's melody, threading itself through his own. He faltered, just slightly, but enough for the closest listeners to notice the stumble. He forced his hands back into rhythm, but the seed of panic had been planted. From the shadows of the wings, Lila watched. She hadn't meant to linger, but something compelled her to stay. She studied him, the stiffness in his shoulders, the tightness around his mouth. To the untrained eye, it was brilliance, but she saw the cracks. She heard what wasn't there. As Marcus finished the first piece, the applause erupted politely, though not thunderously. He rose, bowed, and sat again, his throat dry. He started the second, faster this time, trying to overpower the memory with volume and speed. The audience clapped again when he finished, but the applause felt thinner, less certain. It was during the interlude, as he dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief and took a sip of water, that the director approached him on stage with a smile too wide to be casual. "Marcus," he said into the microphone, projecting his words to the audience, "I've heard a little rumor that something rather unexpected happened during rehearsal. Apparently, one of our staff has quite the hidden talent." The crowd murmured with interest. Marcus froze, the glass of water trembling in his hand. He forced a laugh. "Oh, just a bit of fun. Nothing serious." But the director, sensing opportunity, pressed on. "Well, I say let the audience decide. Ladies and gentlemen, shall we give her a chance?" The audience erupted in curiosity, clapping and calling out encouragement. Marcus's smile stretched painfully thin. He tried to protest, but the sound of approval drowned him out. The director gestured toward the wings. "Miss Johnson?" Would you please join us? Lila's heart stopped. For a moment she couldn't breathe. She shook her head, whispering to herself, "No, not me, not now." But all eyes turned toward the shadows, and the ushers near her urged her forward, their faces full of excitement. Her knees trembled as she stepped onto the stage, the lights blinding her. The hall was silent as she approached the piano. The sight of her uniform startled the audience. What was a cleaning woman doing here? Whispers rippled across the seats, skepticism thick in the air. Marcus stood to the side, his face pale, his fists clenched behind his back. He could feel control slipping like sand through his fingers. Lila reached the piano, her hands trembling as she sat. She looked out at the sea of faces, the skepticism, the disbelief, the curiosity. She looked down at the keys, and her breath steadied. She thought of the hours she had stolen as a girl, sneaking into churches to practice on worn instruments, her fingers learning to speak when her voice couldn't. She thought of the years she had given up that dream, trading music for survival. And then she thought of earlier that day, when Marcus had mocked her, when she had let her soul loose just for a moment. Her hands hovered. The room leaned forward. She pressed the first note. It was soft, tender, almost fragile, but it held the room in its grasp. Then another, then a cascade that grew richer, fuller, pulling everyone in. Her body swayed gently with the music as her hands moved faster, sure, weaving a melody that rose and fell like breath itself. The sound was not polished like Marcus's, but raw, alive, brimming with something no practice could mimic, truth. The audience gasped, then hushed again, their disbelief melting into awe. They watched the cleaning woman transform before their eyes into something luminous, her soul spilling out through the keys. Marcus's heart hammered in his chest as he stood frozen, watching the impossible unfold. He had built his entire identity around being untouchable, the master. And here, before the most important audience of his season, a woman he had mocked was surpassing him with nothing but her hands and her heart. The final notes lingered in the air, shimmering like light on water. When silence fell, it was total. Then came the applause, roaring, thunderous, unstoppable. The audience rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, calling her name though they had only just learned it. Lila bowed her head slightly, her cheeks wet with tears she hadn't realized had fallen. For a moment she had thought this dream was gone forever, but now the sound of their voices, their applause, told her she had been wrong. Marcus's face burned. He forced his smile again, but it was too late. The audience wasn't looking at him anymore. They were looking at her. And he knew, with a sinking certainty, that everything had changed. The applause refused to stop. It rolled across the concert hall like a storm, the thunder of clapping hands shaking the chandeliers. People were on their feet, calling out, whistling, demanding more. Lila sat at the piano, frozen, overwhelmed by the sea of faces staring back at her, not with scorn, not with mockery, but with awe. The sound was deafening, yet within it she felt a stillness, a strange calm that came only when one's soul was finally seen. She blinked through tears, pressing her hand to her chest, unable to believe what she had just done. Marcus stood off to the side, his body rigid, his face stretched into a smile that felt like glass about to crack. He clapped twice, forcing the motion, but the sound of his palms was drowned beneath the roar of the audience. This was supposed to be his night. His spotlight. His moment. And now every pair of eyes, every heartbeat in the room, was fixed on a cleaning woman in a faded uniform. The director hurried onto the stage, seizing the opportunity with the instincts of a man who knew a miracle when he saw one. He took Lila's hand and raised it high, his grin wide and genuine. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced over the noise, "Lila Johnson!" The name rippled through the hall, repeated by strangers who had never heard it before but would never forget it now. "Lila! Lila!" The chant built, echoing to the rafters. Lila's legs shook as she stood, bowing awkwardly, uncertain, humbled. She wanted to slip away, to disappear back into the shadows, but they wouldn't let her. The applause chased her every movement. For years she had been invisible, her life measured in hours of scrubbing, polishing, cleaning up after others. Now the hall, The same hall she had kept spotless for years, was a place where her soul had finally been uncovered. Marcus stepped forward, desperate to reclaim the stage. He gestured to the audience, bowing with his practiced flourish. "And of course," he said loudly, his voice straining to cut through, "you must remember who tonight is truly for. I am honored to have shared a moment with our dear staff member, but the performance must continue with the masterwork you have all come to hear." The applause dulled slightly, fading to polite claps. But the energy was different now, unbalanced. The audience's eyes were still on Lila. Whispers ran through the aisles. "Did you hear her? How could she play like that? Incredible. Pure. Better than him." Marcus sat quickly at the piano, striking the keys with violent force, desperate to remind them who he was. The piece began with speed, his fingers a blur, each note technically perfect. But the more he played, the emptier it sounded. The audience listened, but their faces showed it, the disconnect, the lack of feeling. He was fighting, not performing. Competing, not creating. And then, midway through the piece, a mistake. Small, fleeting, but unmistakable. A note struck wrong. He covered it immediately, his fingers leaping back into control, but the crack in his armor was visible. A murmur swept the crowd. Marcus's chest tightened, sweat rolling down his neck. In the wings, Lila watched silently, her hands clasped in front of her. She hadn't wanted this, hadn't planned it, but as she listened now, she understood. Marcus had skill, brilliance even, but his music was a mirror reflecting only himself. What she had given them, without even meaning to, was a window, into grief, into hope, into the messy, painful, beautiful truth of being alive. That was what they had felt. That was why they had risen to their feet. Marcus slammed the final chord and lifted his hands high, his face beaming in forced triumph. The applause came, but it was weaker, scattered, thin compared to before. The audience was polite, respectful, but not moved. Not shaken. He bowed, but the silence that followed carried an edge. The comparison was clear. The director approached the microphone again, his eyes sparkling with a decision he knew would be controversial but unforgettable. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I believe we've all witnessed something truly extraordinary tonight. And I think we'd all like to hear one more piece, from Miss Johnson." The hall erupted again, people on their feet, clapping, chanting her name louder than before. Marcus's heart sank. He turned sharply to the director, his voice low, furious. "This is my concert. My reputation. You cannot do this." The director leaned closer, his whisper sharp. "Your reputation is fading before your eyes. Don't fight what's already decided. They want her." Marcus's face twisted, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. But there was no stopping it. The audience roared louder. Lila hesitated, her body trembling, her instinct begging her to refuse. She didn't belong here. She wasn't trained for this. She wasn't dressed for this. She was just a woman who cleaned floors. But then she saw them, the faces of people leaning forward, eyes wide, hopeful, desperate to hear her again. And she realized something. All her life, she had played music in private, in secret, afraid it would never matter. But now, for once, she had a chance to give it away. She sat once more at the piano. The hall hushed instantly. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and let her fingers fall. The melody began soft, a lullaby born from memory, weaving through sorrow and tenderness, then growing into something grand and soaring. Her hands moved as if guided by something beyond her, her body swaying, tears spilling as she played. The music rose and fell like waves, carrying the audience with it, lifting them higher, breaking them open. People wept openly. Some held hands. Strangers leaned toward one another, united in awe. The hall felt transformed into something sacred. When the final note faded into silence, no one moved. For a heartbeat, it was as if the world itself had stopped breathing. Then, the applause erupted, not polite, not expected, but wild, uncontrollable, like a dam breaking. People stood, stamping their feet, clapping until their hands burned, shouting her name again and again. Lila bowed her head, overwhelmed, her body trembling. She had never dreamed of this moment, never thought it possible. And yet here it was, given to her not through ambition or ego, but through truth. Marcus sat frozen, staring at her, his face pale, his chest hollow. He had always believed himself untouchable. But in one evening, everything had been undone, not by a rival pianist, not by a critic, but by the very woman he had mocked, a woman he thought beneath him. The taste of humiliation was bitter, but worse was the knowledge that he would never outshine what had just happened. Not tonight. Not ever. The director returned to the microphone, his voice almost breaking with excitement. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can all agree we have discovered a new star tonight. Remember the name Lila Johnson. This is only the beginning. The crowd thundered her name again, the sound shaking the very walls. Lila stood, tears streaming down her cheeks, and bowed one final time. She glanced toward Marcus, not with cruelty, not with triumph, but with quiet dignity. Then she turned, walking off the stage, her shoulders straight, her spirit lighter than it had ever been. That night, when the lights dimmed and the crowd spilled into the streets buzzing with the memory of what they had witnessed, one truth remained carved into the history of the hall. Genius had revealed itself not in the man who demanded attention, but in the woman who had been invisible until the music spoke for her.